This program is proudly brought to you by the French American Heritage Foundation of Minnesota. We are 501c3 foundation.
We're going to celebrate something that happened 175 years ago, and that is the building of a little log chapel in St. Paul, right on the intersection of Minnesota Street and Kellogg Boulevard. And this picture that just went black is actually a picture of St. Paul in 1849, and that little building to the far left is this little log chapel that we're celebrating tonight. And the interesting story about this little log chapel is that it became a cathedral, became the first Catholic school in Minnesota, St. Joseph Academy. Then it became the first hospital in Minnesota, St. Joseph Hospital. And then it became the name of a town, St. Paul, and finally the name of the capital of our state. So it's a wonderful little story. We brought in a speaker tonight. I'm going to now introduce Mr. Joe Amato. Joe's going to come up here and introduce our featured speaker for the evening. Joe Amato is a noted teacher, public speaker, scholar, and author. He was a professor at Southwest Minnesota State University in Marshall, where he was the founder and chair of the history department there. He has written a number of books and won the Minnesota Humanities Prize for Literature in 2005. And Joe is going to come up and tell you a little bit and introduce our featured speaker for the night. Joe, you want to come up?
Cette occasion de la fête de Toussaint, welcome on this evening of All Saints, a day dedicated to our living and dead ancestors and historians. Since historians are more than keepers of graves and genealogical records, historians recognize that we live the past. We keep it and feed it with memory, and it nourishes us with stories and understanding. We have with us this evening, as is appropriate, on All Saints Day, a very talented historian who's written on all the topics, almost all the topics that pertain to us. Marais Wingerd, who has very graciously consented to come from the Department of History at St. Cloud University, where she's taught for 10 years, perhaps more. She got her BA at McAllister College, her MA and PhD from Duke University, respectively in 1993 and 1998. I only wish to call your attention to two books. A great book called North Country, which is a sweeping vision of the making of Minnesota and its peoples. It's wonderful in its true diversity and variety of peoples. It's a marvelous book that has the big view before Minnesota was a state. In the second book, probably the one that interests us more this evening, she has a book, Claiming the City, which is a nice introduction to the history of St. Paul, but again with special stress on ethnicity and the Catholic Church. There's a lot more I'd like to say, because I'd like to give a speech too. You get accustomed to that after years. But I won't. I just wish that you all give a grand welcome, un grand bienvenue, Marais Wingerd.
We're talking about French history to a bunch of French descendants. And I'm afraid that, you're going to have to bear with me because there are probably things that you know more about than I do. Remember, I'm a generalist.
We're not a violent group.
Huh?
We're not a violent group.
Okay, no throwing tomatoes or anything. And also, I need to tell you that I picked up my French as an adult, and so, well, I think I'm quite good. Generally, French speakers can't understand what I'm saying. So the main reason I studied French was so I could say the names of the people that I researched. and I can kind of do it. So,
Can you use the mic? Is there a chance you can use
do you need the mic? Well, I'm afraid if I pick it up, I'm going to start. I'm afraid if I pick it up, I'm going to start singing. You know, every time I get a mic in my hand, I really wish I was Barbara Streisand. Believe me, you don't want to hear that. So, with that, with all those caveats, I will begin to talk a bit about the French imprint on St. Paul, on the beginnings of St. Paul. And I love to talk about this subject because it really puzzles me that so little attention has been given to the importance that French and French Canadian people had on shaping Minnesota. I mean, I really find that's pretty peculiar since from the very beginnings of European contact with Native people in this region, the French were right in the middle of things. They were the first people to encounter the Dakota and the Ojibwa and really set the tone of the interactions that characterized this region for 200 years. And they continued to be an important part of the history all the way into the mid-19th century. And I'll say a little more about that, where I consider that to be my end point. And I want to point out the seal of Minnesota, and as Mark said, the state motto, L'Étoile du Nord, of course, is Star of the North in French. And you may not know, but it is the only state motto that's in French. Yes, the only one. And yet, even though in 1849, or in the 1850s, when they were devising what this motto would look like, clearly they understood the importance of the French. But they didn't make it into the history books as much as I feel they ought to. And I think that much of this has to do with the agenda of the first generation of chroniclers of Minnesota history. The State Historical Society was founded, get this, in 1849, the same year that Minnesota became a territory, which is pretty unusual that they would be thinking about establishing a historical society so early on. Here's one of the founders. The charter members included names that are probably familiar to you: Alexander Ramsey, Henry Sibley, who is featured here, Henry Rice, who I believe has no redeeming qualities, but that's for another talk. Edward Duffield Neal, important minister, and he had his hands into lots of things. Charles K. Smith, who was the secretary of the territory, and even Harriet Bishop. But what you might notice, and even though I didn't name all the names, I can assure you that French names are noticeably missing from the founding members of the Historical Society. And in fact, even though 2 years later, William LaDuc becomes quite involved, you might say, well, there's a French, there's some French influence. But William LaDuc was born in Ohio, was a lawyer, came to Minnesota with the same kind of agenda that the other founders had, to turn this wild and uncivilized place into this shining city where they would all make a fortune.
Yeah.
So they were in charge of writing the history of this region. And Edward Duffield Neal said, "Write your history as you go along, and you will confer a favor upon the future inhabitants of Minnesota, for which they will be ever grateful." But I think what's even more telling is something else that was another account of the founding of the Historical Society that was written shortly after the turn of the century. And the author says, the Minnesota Historical Society not only existed, but prospered. And the reason is clear. The men who founded it and guided it during the first few decades of its life were the makers of Minnesota itself. They were laboring hard to wrest civil order out of the wild scramble of settlers who were arriving daily by wagon and riverboat. And I assure you, they included the French residents of this region as part of that wild scramble. They were the leaders in many and various civil enterprises, and they wanted the cultural as well as the material to be represented. And this is my favorite line. These men knew that they were making history, and they wanted their part in it perpetuated. So of course, history does tend to be written by the winners, and we don't always get the fullest picture, and that certainly is the case here. Now, these fine, upstanding gentlemen happily celebrated the bravery and the feats of the French explorers, names that are familiar to us like Radisson, Duluth, Le Sueur, Hennepin, names that are actually embedded in our past, or embedded in the landscape at least, because they represented romantic figures from the misty past who first made Minnesota known to the European world. And they had the right cachet for this story. As this painting, which some of you may be familiar with, of Father Hennepin discovering St. Anthony Falls, as they put it, and this hangs in the governor's reception room. So it tells you that this was considered an important part of the past, but they were far less interested in documenting the centrally important role that was played by the more modest and, in their eyes, culturally unambitious French Canadians, who were the majority of the non-Indian population when Minnesota became a territory in 1849. Do you recognize these two? This is Benjamin and Genevieve Gervais, who I will speak more of later. And I'm very sorry that the only photograph I have is in their old age, because he was quite a guy. But just to give you an example of the people who weren't in the history book, they were even less enthusiastic about mixed blood fur traders and veterans of the trade who lived by rules that seemed inexplicable to Yankee newcomers. People who had mixed French and, not always French, but oftentimes French and Indian heritage, who created a hybrid society that was neither fully Indian nor fully white, as it would be determined in the more settled parts of the country. And they found a way to coexist together and appreciate one another in a manner that lasted for 200 years. But for a long time, until recent years, that wasn't really part of the narrative of Minnesota. They were pushed to the side, called half-breeds, uneducated, uncivilized, and so on. But the reality is that when these newcomers came up the Mississippi River, when Minnesota became a territory, Minnesota seemed like a foreign land to them. To these officials, land speculators, and settlers who debarked at the future territorial capital of St. Paul, and it should have looked like a foreign land, because it was different from anything they had ever experienced, with this cosmopolitan, multicultural, fluid society. And in fact, one of the great stories about these newcomers coming to St. Paul has to do with the trial, one of the first trials that took place. And the judge, after they seated the jury and after the case was adjudicated, he turned to Henry Sibley, who was always in the middle of everything, and he said, "I'm very impressed with these people. They took everything so seriously." And Henry Sibley later recounted he didn't have the heart to tell him that none of them spoke English. Because it was French that was the lingua franca of this region. French, and also a French and Indian patois, but English was not the first language of most of the people who lived here. In fact, better than half the population of the territory was French Canadian, and nearly all of them were connected to the Dakota or the Ojibwe, either by birth or by marriage. In fact, the settlement of Pembina near the Canadian border was home to almost a population that was almost entirely of mixed ancestry, French and Indian, who saw themselves as a separate people. And so to the people coming from the east, they did look like people from a foreign land. But the thing to keep in mind is that when Minnesota became a territory, Pembina was the second most populous place in Minnesota, second only to St. Paul. So the people of Pembina were very important politically. They really helped keep the Democratic Party in power, not only through the territorial period, but well into statehood as well. They were the undergirding for Henry Sibley and Henry Rice, and the direction that Minnesota politics went in this time period. But still, the French Canadians and the mixed blood settlers received little attention as the wannabe civic leaders began to write what they called their history as we go along. The nouveau city builders strove to elevate their personal social status as well as the social cachet of their muddy little hamlet. This is St. Paul in 1857. So picture what it looked like in the 1840s. So one of the things you have to keep in mind as you think about this is that the people who came here, the people who were the cream of the crop here, were probably not the cream of the crop where they came from. Because if you were part of the social elite, if you were financially successful, if you had all the trappings that go with being upper class, why on earth would you leave and come to Minnesota? So they were very intent on kind of building up their position. This was their opportunity to be somebody on the top of the heap. And as part of that cultural project, they drew a sharp distinction between French and French Canadian. I'm going to say more about this as we go along, but just for the moment, keep in mind that particularly for this group of people, French from France had an aristocratic cachet that put a nice veneer on this shabby little place. French Canadians were something else. Yes. They loved the idea of the explorers from the misty past who had lace-covered sleeves, and they were romantic and dashing. And they cheerfully celebrated those French. And new arrivals who came, who had genuine French credentials, were also welcomed quickly into the so-called society of the emerging town. But generally, these were people who shared the same aspirations with the other city builders. People like Auguste Larpenteur, William LaDuc, who I mentioned, both of whom were American-born and traced their ancestry back to France. But they were also part of this kind of modern outlook, this idea that they were going to build a city, that they were part of the engine that made capitalism go. But the voyageurs and the petty traders of the fur trade, who had called this region home for 200 years, they were more problematic. This was a problem of both class and culture. In the words of Lawrence Tolliver, who was the Indian agent in from 1920 till 1939, he found them to be entirely uncivilized and described them as these Mississippi Deni civilized Canadian mongrel English American citizens. And probably the one who gave him the most headaches was Alexis Bailey, who was a trader and was rough and tumble at the, he was kind of the apex of the rough and tumble traders. And this is Alexis and his wife, Lucy Faribault Bailey. And they look pretty respectable, don't they? Well, of course, portraits can do a lot for you. As we all know. But, I mean, Henry Sibley got his opportunity to come and be the agent for the American Fur Company precisely because Tolliver could not get along with this guy who he considered to be completely uncivilized. So if you can imagine, he couldn't get along with these two. You can imagine what he thought about the laborers of the trade, who were much more somewhere between Métis, the people from Pembina that I showed you earlier, and more Americanized whites, I would say. And these people are almost all of mixed ancestry. So I like this image because it really shows them at work. And this is another by the artist Peter Rindesbacher who lived among them. And I love this picture because it really shows the hybrid nature of their culture. Because you can see all sorts of European elements as well as native elements. These people simply did not fit in with the idea of city building. So the first residents of St. Paul, what we know as St. Paul now, were a combination of these fur trade veterans and also refugees from the ill-fated Red River settlement in present-day Manitoba. They were lured there under totally false pretenses that the climate was wonderful, the growing season was long, everything was going to be wonderful, everything was terrible. So from the early 1820s onward, there would become straggling wagon trains of people trying to escape, basically, from the colony. There was no way to go back to Hudson Bay, which is the way they had come in. The only way out was to come south into Minnesota. Most of the people continued on to Illinois or Iowa, but some just said, this is as far as I can go. And the commandants at Fort Snelling allowed them to stay and make a home on the military reserve. But of course they had no actual title to the land there. And most of these people were either French Canadian or Francophone Swiss. Among them we had Abraham Marais and his wife Marianne. And he became a very prosperous farmer. In fact, it was said that he had the biggest herd of cattle in the region other than Joseph Renville, who was way out west by Lac qui Parle. And Marianne was an important part of the community because she was an accomplished midwife, something that was very necessary for the people in the community and at the fort. Also among them was Vito Guerin, who some of you may know, maybe related to, and Benjamin and Genevieve Gervais, and their brother Pierre. Here's the picture again of the Gervais and Vito Guerin. So this group of originally refugees established farms and created a community. So by 1838, there were 157 people living on the reserve. But in 1838, because as part of a complicated scheme that the Fort Commandant was involved in to get control of the northern pinelands, he ordered all non-military personnel off the reserve and lobbied Washington to enlarge the reserve significantly. His argument was that everybody was selling whiskey to the soldiers and the Indians, but the reality was something quite a bit more complicated. But because of the Treaty of 1837, the year before, this wasn't too big of a problem because they could move right across the river. And all the land on the east side of the Mississippi was now open for settlement. And so that's what most of them did. They moved directly across, near where Fountain Cave is. I don't know if you know where that is. It's like a block and a half from my house. Every time I walk along the river, I think, gosh, this is where they were. I love being a historian. So many of these displaced farmers moved across the river and began to clear their land and create a new homestead, never imagining that these lands could ever be considered part of the reserve as well. After all, they had been ceded in 1837. But unfortunately, it proved to be the case that Plimpton was successful in encompassing all those lands. And in 1840, soldiers from the fort came, and because the settlers by this time were not willing to just walk away, they burned them out of their cabins and left them with nothing. This is a map of what the military reserve looked like after it was reconfigured. So you can see this peculiar wedge that comes out onto the east side of the river. And the main purpose of this was to keep steamboats from being able to get up to St. Anthony Falls. And because Plimpton had investments at St. Anthony Falls, he was trying to keep competitors out. However, the people who had the long-term vision, people like Franklin Steele, who had made the most significant claim at the falls, thought he was crazy because how could you develop this place if nobody can get to it? But apparently the commandant wasn't as clever as Franklin Steele. So that's really why the settlers were forced out. So what did they do? Well, they floated down the river to beyond the perimeter of the reserve, where you can see on the right side where the border is, and that's where they docked at a place called Grand Marais, which was actually informally known as Pig's Eye Landing. And we all know about Pig's Eye Landing. So this is the haphazard way that the city of St. Paul was born. Now, a few French Canadians enthusiastically embraced progress. I don't want to give you the idea that there are no exceptions to the people who had a different vision. Most notably, it was those who had been in the upper echelon of traders, men like Jean-Baptiste Faribault, founder of Faribault, and in St. Paul, Louis Robert Street, who made a fortune in land speculation, entrepreneurial ventures, and in managing the politics of St. Paul's French Canadians. And I chose this image to show you because I think this really suggests how important, how prosperous Louis Robert was, that in 1860 he could have a house like this. Remember what most of St. Paul was looking like at that time. And you can see that the sidewalk is a plank sidewalk still. And it also looks like the builder didn't really have a plumb line. I'm not sure about that. But he was the exception, and neither the Red River refugees nor the displaced laboring class of the fur trade, who comprised most of the population of St. Paul, shared Yankee ambitions to accumulate wealth and status. Their values were different. What they worked for was to build a community of mutual support and conviviality. They weren't thinking about trying to get rich. And again, I'll put two of my favorite photos up here. In fact, early settlers like Benjamin Gervais and Vito Guerin were most clearly remembered for their willingness to give things away, including land. Guerin, who described himself as feeling lonesome and wanting a neighbor, gave half his claim in St. Paul to Pierre Gervais, who had been burned out by the soldiers. Pierre's brother Benjamin and Guerin donated the land for the first Catholic church. You know I was going to get there eventually. Yes. These early residents generously gave parcels of their land for any good civic cause. But invariably, contemporary chroniclers of St. Paul, when you get in those old dusty volumes, they would note invariably that despite the fortunate land that these settlers had once held, they died poor. The implication is, of course, that they were failures, simple people. And yet, by their standards, I think they considered that they had made great successes of their lives. By the mid-1840s, Benjamin Gervais had sold his property in St. Paul to Louis Robert for $500, which, of course, in the history book is noted it was worth millions now. And he moved to establish the first farm in what became Little Canada. He was a founding member of that community, and a community that more closely reflected the values of family and mutual support that the French Canadians held dear. He died with only $200 in savings, but probably considered himself a rich man. This is the schoolhouse in Little Canada. How many of you have live in Little Canada or have ancestors that lived in Little Canada? Just wonderful French-Canadian enclave. And of course, other French Canadians settled White Bear, Centerville, that kind of northern tier. And I don't know why they left. I can only assume it was because what the city was becoming didn't really mesh with the lifestyle that they were looking for. But back to St. Paul and a very different element of French influence. So along with the farm families like the Guerins and the Gervais, Pig's Eye drew a cohort of former fur trade workers who would become the laboring class of the growing settlement. And though they would come to be romanticized as gay, carefree, colorful figures, the voyageurs, right? They worked hard. They had, and they were victims of a changing economy, where their jobs in the trade were disappearing. They are characterized this way, much the way the Indians were after they were removed from Minnesota, as romantic and colorful without really exploring their full humanity. The former voyageurs in St. Paul were regarded as a problem by the emerging elites of what was still at this time known as Pig's Eye. To the city builders, they seemed lazy and feckless and had no ambition. But for the most part, their worldview was just closer to their Indian kin than to this new generation of movers and shakers. So the city builders felt like they had a problem, and the laborers of the town weren't that happy either. So when Father Lucien Galtier arrived in 1841 to build the first church in the settlement, he was greeted enthusiastically by Catholics and Protestants alike. Now, it's not surprising that the French Canadians and the small number of Irish Catholics who were also beginning to settle at Pig's Eye, these people who made up the laboring class, it's not surprising that they were delighted to welcome Father Galtier and willingly donated the land and the labor, Mark's ancestors, to build the Chapel of St. Paul on the bluff above the river. But the Protestants were at least as pleased as the Catholics with the arrival of this first permanent church in the settlement. Now, this might seem surprising given the hostility that the Catholic Church was facing throughout most of the United States at this time. But several circumstances combined to give the Catholic clergy a very warm welcome here. So first, you need to picture Pig's Eye. In 1841, Little Pig's Eye was home to about 15 households, most of them Catholic, along with a number of whiskey sellers and plenty of single men. It was a rowdy, undisciplined place, and yet it still seemed like a potential gold mine to the entrepreneurs and the men on the make who were coming up the river on the steamboats. It was all about location, location, location. Because, thanks to Major Plimpton's machinations on the reserve, this little landing had become the practical head of navigation for the Mississippi River, and also the terminus of the Red River trails that connected the rest of the continent to the wealth of the Canadian fur trade. No one doubted that this little place had a great future, but in the meantime, the incipient city builders had a hard time managing the polyglot, mostly Catholic, population who resided in or stopped by the settlement causing trouble. They recognized that a church was an important tool of civilization. And since most of the laboring poor were Catholic, a Catholic church was just the ticket. So the Catholics and the Protestants alike enthusiastically agreed to Father Galtier's suggestion that St. Paul might be a more dignified name than Pig's Eye for an up-and-coming town. And so St. Paul was born. Now, Father Galtier didn't stay too long. He quickly found that he was not really suited to the rough and tumble environment of St. Paul, but he was soon replaced by Augustin Ravoux, who had spent years among the Indians and he became an influential member of the town. And in 1851, when St. Paul was named the seat of the new diocese, the news was greeted with anticipation rather than alarm by the city at large. As one newspaper editorial enthused, this will ensure the building of a splendid cathedral here to supply the religious wants of the numerous members of that denomination and, incidentally, add to the architectural beauty of our growing town. Bishop Joseph Cretin, who's on the left, became a powerful figure, guiding the Catholic vote and serving numerous civic needs. Because the Catholics went to work immediately. Their ranks soon increased with the arrival of 4 French nuns from St. Louis, and they established schools, a Catholic temperance society. They cared for orphans and the poor. They built a hospital just in time to deal with a devastating cholera epidemic. The newspapers rhapsodized over the sisters as angels of mercy. And by the time the first Protestant church was built in 1848, the Catholics were well established and continued to set the pace for community service. But it wasn't only the services they provided, nor was it just a potential for social control that paved the way for the Catholic Church in the emerging town. We have to think about this now. It was the fact that all these early priests and nuns who served St. Paul were French, from France. At a time when most of the Catholic clergy in the United States was Irish, and this is a time when anti-Irish sentiment is at its high point, the priests who came to Minnesota were French. Remember who the elites of St. Paul are. They just really love having, the French aristocrats come to town. And these priests were part of the educated bourgeoisie. And most of them were also hardened by years of work among the Indians. And so they were adventurers and considered brave as well. Even though they looked pretty tame here, there was a lot going on with these guys. In short, they seemed as dashing as the French explorers from days gone by. So, in a community that was starving for class and polish, they were the perfect new residents, and they were eagerly accepted into the best circles. Now, I want to be clear, this did not transfer immediately, or even very soon, into prosperity, material prosperity for the majority of the town's Catholics. In fact, as one seminarian described the local Catholics in 1852, he said, "The Catholics here are very poor, half-breeds, Canadians, and Irish. The Yankees have all the influence, the wealth, and the power, though they are not as numerous as the others." But what this did do is establish a strong and politically powerful institutional structure that preceded rather than followed the waves of Irish and German Catholic immigrants who would inundate the city in the next century. What it really did is it paved the way for the influence that the Catholic Church continued to have throughout the 20th century, in the city of St. Paul. It has always been a really important influence. But interestingly, I'm not sure how much the French Canadians benefited from this. By 1900, and this is where I ask your help because now we get to my research questions that I don't have answers to. By 1900, less than 3% of the city's population was either first or second generation French Canadian. That's less than 5,000 people. So I'm not sure what this means. I mean, it may mean simply that they've been there so long that the census wouldn't pick up their ethnicity. It may mean that they anglicized their names after the Dakota War of 1862 because there was such a presumption that people with a French surname were part Indian. It may mean that they left. It may mean that they found St. Paul to be not the congenial community that they desired, and they may have migrated north, or gone to Little Canada, or gone to White Bear. But for whatever reason, the ethnic group that was the majority population becomes almost insignificant by the turn of the century. But whether they stayed or they left, they put their imprint on this town. So, I love this. You can see how St. Paul has changed. This is 1889, I think. This is the completion of the Northern Pacific Railway. And my favorite thing is St. Paul, the center of North America. So we know who wrote the history, right? But we know that the way this city looks today has a very significant French imprint. Thank you. Take your questions or corrections.
I think it's a Great Northern Railway.
No, that was the Northern Pacific. The Northern Pacific was first. The Great Northern was more important. But the Northern Pacific was completed first.
The capital of Minnesota House of Representatives in the ceiling has all French Canadian explorers' names. How did that come about?
Gosh, I don't know. The capital wasn't built until, when was it finished? I think 1916 maybe it was finished, something like that. So it's much later, but the explorers, the explorers are, they're part of legend. And we have Radisson hotels, worldwide.
The land where the capital is located was donated by French Canadians.
Yay! Yes. You and then.
Where was the original chapel then? I've never really understood.
It's on Kellogg Boulevard, and there's a big rock
Oh.
that marks where it was. Is it Kellogg in Minnesota?
Queen Cedar, Minnesota, memorial there.
Queen Cedar, Minnesota.
And it was originally Bench Street.
And they did, by the time Bishop Cretin came, they were already on their third church. They had a cathedral now, and the congregation had grown so significantly. So they really had a leg up over all the Protestant denominations, and ironically, one of the things that I think is really fascinating is because the Catholics were so active in serving the community, it served as a spur to all these Protestant congregations to do the same work. So St. Paul had a wonderful network of social services in this early period as they're vying for loyalty, in the city. You don't want the Catholics to get ahead.
I would just like to have everybody raise their hand that has some Indian blood in them. Huh? Just for your own,
Well,
raise your hand. I know you do.
Well, and I was going to talk about that, and it didn't fit into my talk too much, but when I was doing my research, because I always say to people, if you have a French surname, and you were here before Minnesota became a state, you pretty much, for sure, have some Indian ancestry. But it was interesting because I was looking at sources, older sources, particularly about Little Canada, and none of the individuals who were profiled, it was never mentioned that any of them had, were mixed blood or had any kind of Indian ancestry, because I think for so many years it was something people felt like they had to hide. And that's really it's the residue from 1862. Because after 1862, to be an Indian, to have any Indian blood was, yes, and that's why I think we see an out-migration from St. Paul of people with French Canadian names. I think that, I'm just speculating. This is my project that I don't have any evidence for yet. But I think that you see people either anglicizing their names or finding it to be so inhospitable that they just leave. Mm-hmm. Whereas, the great irony is that, of course, for many generations, to be of mixed ancestry was a great asset to the community, because these were the people who were the mediators between the whites and the Indians. So, and I didn't really talk about that tonight, but that's kind of a subject for a book. Yeah, John.
Mary, do we have any records that would allow us to see marriage, baptismal, and death records with names on them from 1850 to 1865? And guess at church attendance?
Well, and that's not something I have really pursued, but I know that we have records from 1838. There's an old article. They found these records, I think they found them in Dubuque, which was the archdiocese before St. Paul was established. Father, I can't remember what the priest was, who came up anyway to Fort Snelling. Just a missionary stop, and he baptized and married and confirmed dozens and dozens of people. And there you'll see, and it gives the godparents as well. And I mean, you see how interconnected these people are, but it'll say, Joe Laframboise and a Sioux woman. So we know, I mean, most people who lived in this region were either descended from or married to people who were descended from Dakota or Ojibwe people. Yes?
I have two comments. First of all, that original chapel was 18 by 24, which is more or less from the screen to the post. in length and 18 feet wide, so it was not a large structure. The other thing, in answer to, or attempt to answer your question, the last census where the question was asked about ethnicity, I've heard was 1980, and in that census, 8% of Minnesotans identified themselves as being at least partially French ancestry. So there were a large number of us around here.
But not necessarily in St. Paul.
Not in St. Paul, no.
And that's what I find is interesting. Well, of course, because you're everywhere. But St. Paul, remember, you're you personally, but, French Canadians were the majority population of this place. So, yes.
I can remember hearing a lecture you gave here a couple of years ago in which you explained that the reason why the French got along, or one of the reasons why they got along with the native people, was because their industry was the fur trade. It didn't involve ownership of land or division of the land. How does that jive with the fact that now these French people started to settle out and to farm and to buy and own land, much as the English, or the people coming from the east did?
Well, as long as the fur trade was viable, nobody wanted settlers. Because, the mantra was, the settlement kills the trade. But the trade was no longer, the trade was sinking in red ink by the 1830s. And so these people they're not Indians. I mean, they appreciated the same kind of values. They learned to appreciate those same kind of values. But when there's no other way to make a living, many of them turn to farming. But if you think about these early proprietors of St. Paul, people like Vito Guerin, they were very generous about giving land away as well. I don't think that they had that same, at least that generation, didn't have that same kind of proprietary sense about owning land. But it's hard to get inside people's heads, too. All we can see is what they did, and then speculate about why. I'd love to get inside people's heads. Any other questions?
Who was that priest? Okay, you have a picture of Father Cretan on the left. Who is the guy on the right?
Oh, that's Father Ravou. And he's really the one, Ravou, R-A-V-O-U-X.
Okay.
He's really the one who was the pastor of St. Paul. Father Gaultier didn't stay very long. He really felt like a fish out of water here. And he had been, I believe he had been, come right out of the seminary in France, and then was kind of thrown into this, and he just wasn't happy. He wasn't happy here for some reason I can't imagine. Yes.
What was the picture of the white building with all the children or whatever?
Oh, that was that is the first school in Little Canada. That picture's taken in 1909. So, I mean, the thing about Little Canada is you see these people like Benjamin Gervais and everyone who settled there for many, many years was French Canadian, and that they built this strong community with community institutions and built a church and a school, and to my mind, you know, they were totally successful. They didn't get rich, but they had a wonderful quality of life in their community.
Does Gervais translate to Lake Jarvis?
Yes. 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 But you know, I took French as an adult. So I like to say Gervais because, hey. Yes. All those names are, they sound different now. Yes.
Just say for those who are first speakers here, there is a memoir written by Father Raoul in French, which is available in